These questions a little bit further. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to talk about ART. It stands for Applied Response Technology. In-spill response, again, we'll talk about it's just kind of like a, you always get it. You always get the background and sort of the legislative context for any of the stuff that we do. I'll talk about oil spill cleanup agents. It's a type of applied response technology, a fairly broad class. Dispersants are one type of oil spill cleanup agent, and they sort of get, it's kind of like a Broadway show in a way with a huge chorus. And dispersants, the chorus is all of the oil spill cleanup agents, but dispersants are always out there in front because they're just so special. So we have a California dispersant plan that in particular addresses this one hot button oil spill cleanup agent. So it is one type of oil spill cleanup agent, but there is a whole plan devoted to it. The other type of applied response technology, there's only two, In-Situ Burn and oil spill cleanup agents. So we'll also talk about In-Situ Burn, and then hopefully also with this we'll leave some time for questions and discussion. But I'm just going to spend some time snowing you here at the start. So here's our definition for applied response technology. Are there any response technology other than mechanical cleanup that can be used to address an oil spill? So it's basically the chemical and biological agents. It can be dispersants, other chemical countermeasures, which can include the biologicals like the bioremediants, and non-chemical sorbents. Depending on whether you work with the federal government or the state government, the feds consider sorbents not an oil spill cleanup agent, so they exempt them from everything. And in California, we look at them a little bit differently, and we look at each one and say, is that something we should give an exemption to, or does it potentially have an effect that we want to issue a license for? We'll talk about licensing too. And then In-Situ Burning. So these two, I guess this is just one of the first anchoring moments. There are two different types of applied response technology: use of oil spill cleanup agents, a fairly broad class, or In-Situ Burning. So you guys have probably heard about this already, but there are a number of different oil spill response options, and we don't necessarily use them just in isolation. We can use more than one at a time. What we typically use are the mechanical ones, the skimmers, various types of containment, sorbent boom, because that will get the oil off the water. Not all of it, but it gets it off the water. In-Situ Burning, also in a different way, gets oil off the water. Dispersants and other oil spill cleanup agents, they're not mechanical. They don't get oil off the water. In some cases you can get some more off the water, but for the most part they put your oil in a different environmental compartment where hopefully they cause less harm than if they stayed at the surface. So it's a very strategic, calculated, fairly deliberate decision-making process about what you do when. And you've probably heard about this before too. I think people think that there's, it's bad when oil spills, right? And people expect us to go get it all back into the vessel or the facility or the tank or wherever it came from, and we just can't do that. In spite of all our best efforts, we just can't do that. Once the oil is spilled, there's going to be harm somewhere. Whether it's oil in the water, oil, and you can just barely see this. I don't even know what kind of marine mammal it is. I know it looks like a young sea lion or fur seal or something, or an oiled bird, or just oiled shoreline, rocky mussel beds in this case. The damage happens, and what we're trying to do is get as much of the oil out of the environment as we can, and with the balance of the oil, try to shift it to an environmental compartment that can withstand it best. And understanding that, okay, that means you're choosing to hit that environmental compartment instead of that, but you're trying to shift the negatives around to the least negative. That's what that was all about. Trying to minimize injury as much as possible. Yeah.
This might be a question for the wardens or prior wardens here, but now in the event of some kind of a day-to-day incident where wildlife is injured, say wildlife versus vehicle type thing, the wardens have discretion to euthanize the animal. Is that the case in a large, like I'm just thinking about that poor little pup up there. Like, is that something that would be part of the response?
In California, they do. I mean, I don't know what happens with other states, but once an animal recovered during an oil spill goes into one of our oil and wildlife care facilities, the vets do their triage and decide which are worth saving and which just need to be euthanized.
Okay, so that wouldn't happen in the field. They'd be only collected.
No, it doesn't happen in the field. It gets determined by the vet.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's amazing how, I think that's good in a way because some of the animals, like marine mammals, it depends on which marine mammal. Most of the marine mammals that have a blubber layer, they could probably be fairly coated in oil, and unless they've ingested it or get a lot in the mucous membranes and just get irritated, that sort of dermal coating, even if they've got a whole black jacket on, may not kill them. A total black jacket on a bird is going to be a different story. And a total black jacket on a sea otter or a fur seal that does not have a thick blubber layer, that's probably like instant death. But even sea otters can take a certain amount of oiling before they become hypothermic. So it's I think it's a decision best left to the vet and those with wildlife rehab experience, because they better understand the tolerances that each species has and kind of what their condition was even before they got oiled. I mean, it's not always healthy animals that get oiled, and sometimes, it's just a complication to an animal that was kind of coasting along the edge already.
Thank you. Yeah, I just anticipate that question.
It's a vet decision. Talked a little about this too. I mean, I'm not gonna spend this talk today talking about how we do this. We do it during an incident, kind of trading off the short-term versus long-term impacts to habitats and species at risk. We also do it as part of planning, and we call it, in that context, we call it net environmental benefit analysis or risk assessment or something like that. But it's a big planning process to understand the fate and effects of oil, the toxicity of, say, dispersants when you put them in the water column. How does this stuff move around in the environment? What's the impact of different species or different life stages? And then once you understand all that, which can take a couple days, and just touching the surface of some of those things, I mean, then you could start maybe making some sort of qualitative trade-offs. Is it better to let oil come into a sensitive wetland, knowing that you're not going to be able to get most of it back out? Maybe it's okay if you don't have wildlife in there nesting at the time. Versus treating, say, an offshore oil slick that you can't get at mechanically, maybe treating it with dispersants, but that means fish and larvae that may be in the upper water column and get that first strong hit of dispersed oil. I mean, you need to know what's there and what's going to be impacted and how the population of those most sensitive critters can sustain that loss. And some populations of some critters are just more resilient than others. So we try to understand that as we're doing the short-term versus long-term impacts trade-offs. And that's for any kind of oil spill response. It's not just applied response technologies. It's what's best for the situation, what's best for this incident, what's best for this habitat or this sensitive site, and for what is here now. So everything does have a trade-off. Any kind of response decision we make, even if it's a decision to not do anything, all of those have their consequences. And understanding that there will be an impact, when we're doing our job best is when we've effectively, strategically minimized the harm. We can't erase the harm, but we can try and minimize the harm. So ART use in California, again, it has a couple of different tiers or umbrellas or whatever authorities that it rests under. Our administrator for OSPR has the state's authority over all response technologies to address an on-water oil spill. So, mechanical or applied response technologies, the OSPR administrator for state waters, marine or fresh, has the state's authority. And then for federal waters, the Federal Regional Response Team, you guys probably haven't gotten into that too much, but we do a lot of our planning in this area as part of area committees We have 6 of them in California for the coast. The regional response team covers California, Nevada, and Arizona, mostly federal agencies, but the state is represented on it as well. And they kind of maintain the statewide policies that affect all the regions in California. So the feds also have to approve the use of all applied response technologies to address an oil spill within the federal jurisdiction. So when we say this, the state and the feds define applied response technologies a little bit differently in some cases. I already mentioned that the federal EPA exempts sorbents. It just has a categorical exemption for all sorbents. So those don't need to have any further approval from them before they're used in state or federal waters. But in California, we don't necessarily exempt all sorbents, and so any product that we have licensed or exempted, we review before use and get the OSPR administrator's approval on that. Another definition. So, what's the definition of an oil spill cleanup agent, which we call OSCA? It's a chemical or any other substance that could be biological used for removing, dispersing, or otherwise cleaning up oil or any residual products of petroleum in or on near any waters of the state. That could be marine or freshwater. So our ART licensing applies to Lake Tahoe as equally as it does to 3 miles off the shore. It does not apply to land, and it does not apply to things that aren't oil. So if you want to use a cleanup agent at a tank farm, you can use pretty much anything you want. As long as it's within the confines of the tank or a pond or something like that, and it's not going to get to state waters, it does not need a license from us. If it's not on navigable waters, it does not need to be listed by the federal EPA. You can pretty much use any product you want. But if it is going to touch water, surface waters, then you need to go through kind of a federal and state process. And here again is where, at the state, we're a little bit different. We're the only state in the nation that has its own separate licensing program. All oil spill cleanup agents have to be reviewed by federal EPA and go onto their product schedule or be given an exemption by them from having to be on their product schedule. And that's the case for sorbents. And in California, we have a whole separate licensing process, and I'm in charge of that. And in California, there's got to be a proof of efficacy and what the toxicity is for the federal EPA. In California, we have to have proof of toxicity. It's mostly, how toxic is it? It's not that it has to be non-toxic, but we need to know. We have to have, toxicity tests to tell us how toxic it is. But also, and this is kind of a troubling thing, we have to prove that it does not pose a hazard to the aquatic environment. Hazards can come from things other than toxicity. We can have sorbents made out of peat moss that could change the pH of the water body that's being used in. So we take a look at that. We can have products that are used for sorbing or solidifying oil. They're in a kind of a particulate form, and we might be worried about whether birds or fish or sea turtles might think that that's food and eat it and not digest it, and so it ends up making them feel like they're full when they start it. They don't have a toxic insult, but it has a hazard for the aquatic environment. So in California, we look at the toxic hazards posed by oil spill cleanup agents and other hazards as well. So the OSPR administrator has this authority over licensing and use of all oil spill cleanup agents. It's as part of his authority over response actions in state waters. So again, marine or fresh. They've got to be licensed by us, the administrator. They really mean me. I do the licensing on behalf of the administrator. He signs the license or the exemption form. There can be some experimental use of unlicensed products. It's generally during an oil spill, if we can't find some other licensed product that fits the need, then we can use some other unlicensed products or at least test them out. But generally speaking, all products used in California need to be listed on the federal EPA product schedule or exempted by them, also licensed and or exempted by us. And then still, the regional response team, generally speaking, makes an incident-specific decision about what and where to use any particular oil spill cleanup agent. I think just so get ahead of myself. So here's more on the federal listing of oil spill cleanup agents. They address only the chemical and the biological stuff. They don't talk about sorbents. They review them, but then they exempt them from any further listing or approvals before use. So it's got to be on what they call the product schedule. It's also called the product schedule is part of the National Contingency Plan. And if you just Google NCP product schedule, you'll get the list of all the products they currently have listed in by category. You'll have the MSDSs and whatever tox results that they have to supply to them. Am I starting to mumble? Okay.
Your protection.
Yeah.
Nice.
Probably wish I'd stop yelling in your ear. Jeez.
Yep. You're right here. That's not how many miles away. It's on the microphone.
Can't make me cranky on Thursday morning.
And then recalling it.
And then I feel like I have to whisper. Okay.
Don't get close to the speaker. Please. There you go.
Yeah, I need to be able to read that screen or read that screen.
There's a security zone there.
I know. It's like a whole fishery
take it
closure.
off.
It's an ART technical specialist closure up here. Okay, so back to the federal process. Products must be reviewed by the federal EPA as part of their National Contingency Plan responsibilities and then go on the product schedule or be given an exemption by them. A little bit different for the feds. The oil spill cleanup agents are registered, they're not licensed. Some fewer requirements, but this is kind of, their registration is kind of based on the information that the vendor supplies. They don't do a lot of truthing of it. And then the product schedule can be used by the Federal On-Scene Coordinator for spills on federal waters, but it still needs approval by the regional response team. And generally speaking, just to be more protective and make sure a Fish and Game OSPR is on the regional response team. And when we talk about an RRT approval, we're talking about basically approval by 3 agencies. Well, this keeps changing. But generally, the federal EPA needs to approve the use of an oil spill cleanup agent. Lots of times that request for that use has been made by the Coast Guard. And then if it's in state waters, could impact state waters, then the OSPR administrator, as a member of the RRT or his designee, will weigh in on whether or not there's going to be approval. And that approval is also in consultation with NOAA and with the Department of Interior. And under NOAA, primarily the National Fisheries Service, and under Department of Interior, primarily the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we want to make sure that the critters, especially ones listed in the Endangered Species Act, have been considered, before this approval is given. Because our California licensing does a pretty thorough review, and because we've done a lot of the kind of net environmental benefit analyses and trade-offs ahead of time, and have particularly spent a lot of time reviewing a couple of different kinds of dispersants, our recommendation is generally that we focus not on the whole suite of products that might be on the product schedule, but on the subset that have been further studied and reviewed. And generally those are the California licensed products. There's also a selection guide, and RD stands for Applied Response Technology Evaluation System. So there are a couple other tools that we can use for determining which ART to use in a given situation. So, onwards. National Response Team, their products are the National Contingency Plan and that NCP product schedule. And then it provides some policy and program guidance that trickles down to the Regional Response Team, which does the overall planning, basically even though it's a 3-state thing, California is the only coastal state. So they do a lot of our statewide planning and coordination things. Their product is the Regional Contingency Plan. And there are elements of our area contingency plans, if they're statewide, that fold into the regional contingency plan. And the membership of the regional response team is primarily federal agencies, but then there are also state representatives. And then there's a standing RRT that meets generally 3 or 4 times a year. And then the incident-specific RRT that has those 3 to 5 key agencies that meets and confers during a natural spill to determine what response actions or applied response technologies to use. So, what kinds of chemical countermeasures do we have? I mean, I said before that there's kind of a suite of them. There are ones that can be used for treating the oil in water emulsions that can form as oil on the surface starts to weather. That sometimes can happen pretty quickly. We don't have any licensed in California, but in theory, if we could get that mousse that forms knocked down a little bit, it might make the oil treatable for longer. Generally, once an emulsion forms, you're kind of relegated to just mechanical cleanup. There's also a class called vasoelastizers, or also sometimes called elasticity modifying agents or gelling agents or solidifiers. They integrate with the oil and actually change the chemistry of the oil. They change it into a semi-solid or a solid. And the advantage to that is that the oil doesn't then resheen from it. Once it's bound, it's bound. This thing can hear me breathing. Okay. Shoreline cleaners, in a way, it's kind of like a dispersant. They're kind of formed out of some of the same components, but it's what it says it is. It's used for cleaning riprap or oiled pilings. It's not really used for cleaning, say, sandy beaches or things like that, but it can be used for cleaning harder surfaces, up to and including ship decks, ship hulls. This is what we see the use of more in freshwater systems, like if you have a spill in a river. Sometimes shoreline cleaners will be used along the rocks at the banks of a river. Look at you, I think I went 2 slides ahead. Hurting, damn it. Okay, hurting agents. I'm sorry, I'm coming back to my original form here. Good behaviors all over. Okay, so hurting agents, there aren't many classes of this either. We heard some about one during a technology workshop last week, but they can have some application in systems where you have like a big oil slick on the surface. Maybe it's fairly thin. You can't quite get to it with mechanical boom, or the sea state is kind of rocking, and the oil's getting entrained. And the herders kind of are applied on the open water around the spill and push the oil together, kind of bind it up and thicken it up a little bit. It has a fairly short action time, but what we heard about last week was the potential for using herding agents as a way to facilitate in-situ burning. Instead of using a fire boom, using these herders to kind of corral the oil into a thick enough layer to burn. We don't have any herding agents currently licensed for use in California. Dispersants are the glory girl that gets all the attention. We currently have 4 that are licensed in California. 2 of the Corexit products, they're pretty similar to each other, but Corexit 9500 is what we have most of in California right now. Is the most effective and the least toxic of the products that we have. And that's kind of a trade-off too, because we have some that seem to be less toxic to test animals, but they're also less effective, so you got to pour more on. And at some point, you're ending up just, with the same equation that you have with something that's more effective to begin with. And then we have bioremediants, which can be, we'll talk a little bit more about various classes of them. Sometimes it includes microbes, sometimes it just includes nutrients to help feed the microbes, and then sometimes it's oxygen to support the system if it's becoming a little oxygen deprived. Okay, so we'll talk a little more in particular about the ones we just listed. So emulsion treating agents are basically, emulsions are formed when you get a lot of energy applied to the oil and the water. And once you get the oil and the water mixed, it makes it even harder for that oil to be treated with a dispersant or with a burn. And mechanical tools can recover the oil once that emulsion's stable, but they have kind of a overall kind of a low recovery rate. There is some use of emulsion breakers in inland field production, but we haven't used them in an offshore on-water environment yet. There's some studies going on, mostly up in Alaska, to look a little more at the effectiveness of emulsion treating agents, but still need more research. And we don't have any licensed right now for use in California. Okay, I talked a little bit about this before too, gave you a sneak peek. These elasticity modifiers do bond with the oil, and they form some kind of more solid mass. Doesn't resheen. It can be, I think, kind of helpful to have like a solidifier boom next to a wetland, so that as oil goes in and out with the tide, it's not picking oil off the wetland plants and then just redepositing it each time. It can kind of capture it before it does more harm. Most of them, let's see, I think I have 4 licensed for use in California, and 2 are liquid and 2 are this kind of dry granular form. In California, because we're concerned about that other effects stuff and about whether fish or birds might see solidifiers as a food, we ask that they not be applied loose, but they instead be in their own self-contained boom or socks or pillows. So the regional response team does not currently allow loose solidifiers to be applied on open water, even within an otherwise contained area. They have to be in their own boom. And lots of times they're kind of married, they're kind of coupled with containment boom, and there'll be a liner inside it, which is kind of cool because then they can get some of the sheen or get some of the oil before it maybe entrains under the boom. So only self-contained forms used on open water. That's not the same as loose within a contained area. The state did issue a pre-approval for the use of some modifiers. The 4 that we have, I think we have 4 licensed, but only 2 are actually available in a self-contained form. But because the regional response team also has to issue approval, they haven't done their pre-approval yet. They're a little bit, part of it is that we haven't had the time to finish that conversation with them, but they've got some concerns about issuing pre-approvals. It is a little hard to properly dose solidifiers when you're using them loose. You generally have to use a fairly large amount, almost like a 1-to-1, sometimes a 2-to-1 or more. And I've heard that they can just make a stickier mess out of a sticky mess. You know, they're kind of hard to pick up afterwards. So you kind of need to know what the effect's going to be. In the right situation, they can be very effective. And they have been considered for use, I think as recently as earlier this week, for ships at ground where you maybe want to put solidifiers, the liquid solidifiers, into a fuel tank to keep it from leaking. It does tend to ruin the tank. Shoreline cleaning agents. We haven't talked specifically about dispersants yet, but they do have a surfactant base similar to dispersants. We have a couple of licenses in California, and the one that we like the best right now is it will kind of wash the oil off the rock or the pier or whatever, but then it refloats it. And so if you contain an area, say out in the water, and you have a bank or something that has been oiled, and you apply the shoreline cleaner, then hopefully it'll wash off into the water, float, and you get another chance to recover it. And we're hopeful that it can be used to clean some marsh plants too. Some of these can be a little bit harsh. They'll have like a limonene base or something like that. I mean, really effective cleaner, but it can also be pretty harsh. So it does end up being pretty substrate dependent. They can be enhanced by washing, either this kind of passive flooding of a surface that you've applied the cleaning agent to, or some low pressure washing, or even high pressure washing. This you only want to do on a surface that doesn't have any life forms on it you're really concerned about. Okay, a few words about bioremediants. Kathleen's going to talk a little bit about, she's going to present a case study, basically. So she'll amplify a little bit on this, but Bioremediants are kind of another class of their own that has variations on the theme. It can have microbes in it. Those could be native microbes. Sometimes people will go collect native microbes and then culture them so that you get a nice good dose of them and before you add them back into an oiled environment. And sometimes they're non-native microbes, which sometimes gives us a little pause for concern. It could include just nutrient supplementation, like more nitrogen or more phosphorus, because the critters run out of vitamins after a while, and they run out of air after a while. So sometimes bioremediants don't involve biological elements at all. They don't involve microbes. But whatever you use fosters the bioremediation process. It is a slow-acting thing. Microbes have, small mouth parts. It takes them a while. So generally speaking, it's not used in initial phases of response, but used for follow-up cleanup and polishing, especially for sensitive areas like wetlands, where you don't want to get in with more mechanical. And you'll do it after the oil spill is basically passed. You're not worried about re-oiling, but you still want to treat the oil that got stuck there. During Deepwater Horizon, there's a biochemical strike team that reviewed the use of bioremediants and nutrients and oxygenation, did bench tests, picked out test sites within one of the bays there. A year went by, and then the native system pretty much took care of the bioremediation. And that's what happens in a lot of areas. A lot of our waters have oil in them already, and there are microbes there that are adjusted. I mean, they use oil as a food source, and you don't necessarily need to supplement, and they will have a little population boom when there's oil in the area, and all of a sudden you have like a bunch of teenage boy microbes who are opening the refrigerator and saying, "Thanks for all the oil, I was getting a little hungry." So basically you just need to keep those teenage boys fostered while they empty the refrigerator. Okay, we will spend some time on dispersants, and not enough time. I'm just being a big tease. I mean, if you've got questions about dispersants, we can ask and answer them later, but I think we're going to have to become outside of this room. They are basically two different products, kind of a surfactant and a solvent. They have an oil-loving end and a water-loving end. And you know how they say oil and water doesn't mix? Because there's a tension between the two that keeps them from slipping over into each other. The dispersants manage to get the hydrophobic and the hydrophilic ends aligned so that that interfacial tension relieves a little bit, and you can get some breaking up of the large oil mat into smaller oil droplets. There's a perception that dispersants are toxic, and the Corexit 9500 is the one that's been the best studied, especially post-Deepwater Horizon. And they had to reveal the components of Corexit 9500, and all the components were food grade, cosmetic grade components that we have in a lot of our products already. So in and of themselves, dispersants aren't toxic. And I keep saying it's not what they are, it's what they do. What they do is they break that big surface slick up into small oil droplets, and the small oil droplets with all their nasty bits, especially the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are now in a small particulate form or even dissolved and able to pass over gills of fish or get consumed by critters that wouldn't otherwise see that oil. So you're exposing them, you're exposing a different environmental compartment to oil in a small oil droplet that's now very consumable. And then we have to kind of look at what happens when a critter consumes it. Sometimes nothing, and sometimes something. So it's not so much with the dispersant itself, but what happens when you disperse oil into small droplets into the water column and expose a whole new suite of critters to them. So the dispersant use decision is basically, is it better to leave it at the surface and have it go to a bunch of different geographies and perhaps go inshore and onto sensitive sites? Is it better to treat it with a dispersant when it's further offshore? And yeah, you'll get the upper water column plankton, but there's more of them, and they'll replace themselves pretty quickly. So that's a lot of the trade-off stuff. And are there decisions that we can make, say, with dispersants for treatment of oil further offshore that will protect the more diverse and abundant and sensitive resources closer to shore? And sometimes yeah, and sometimes no. So it's a series of trade-offs and discussions that occur before that decision is made. Typically speaking, the lighter the oil, the easier it is to disperse. But that doesn't mean that we use dispersants on diesels or jet fuels or gasoline, because that just tends to drive stuff into the water. Okay. You have oil, you have dispersant, you shake, and then it all just kind of magically goes away. And I think people think that we think that that's what happens, so we make it go away. We don't make it go away. We break it, with dispersants, you break stuff into smaller particles, and it's, I don't know what an equivalent is. If there was a bilge water dumping at sea, if that ends up being kind of an equivalent parts per million dosing of oil in the water, I don't know. But we know that it doesn't go away, but we know that we break it up and we spread it out. And we lower the concentration of the oil. And that's the effect we want to have. It also makes them about bite-sized for a number of organisms that wouldn't normally have it as a food source. Not that oil, even from any oil spill, a certain amount of it will just naturally disperse into the water. So some of these critters see oil often, and this won't be their first introduction to oil. But the purpose of treating with dispersants is to try and break it into these bite-sized pieces. Sometimes that's good, because microbes can get to it and break it down. It is a food source for them. They'll break it down into carbon dioxide and water. But it also means that the dissolved components of the oil, especially the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, can cross the more sensitive membranes of critters. And then we have to evaluate whether that's better or whether that's worse than leaving it at the surface. Okay, we do have a plan for this. The development of the California dispersant plan took a number of years, and it's one of those living documents that continues to be updated and fussed over and everything else. But originally, the regional response team tasked the area committees to recommend zones for dispersant use in federal waters, so 300 to 200 miles from shore. And each area committee kind of came up with their own zone of operation. And then forwarded those recommendations to the Coast Guard. Coast Guard forwarded it on to the RRT, and for the most part, the RRT approved the recommendations that the area committees came up with. The regional response team gave the area committees 3 different types of zones to consider, and the area committees used 2 of those. There were pre-approval zones that the area committees were comfortable with after doing all the net environmental benefit analyses and many subcommittee meetings. Suggested that there could be pre-approval zones in waters 3 to 200 nautical miles from shore, and that could be the coastline or an island shoreline, except waters that were part of a national marine sanctuary or within 3 miles of the California-Mexico border. Everything else, you would need RRT incident-specific approval. When we talk about pre-approval, we don't mean that means that, say, a platform operator who has a spill off an offshore platform can just go use dispersants on that spill. The RRT approval goes just to the federal on-scene coordinator. And it's the federal on-scene coordinator's discretion whether or not they use dispersants. They can, they don't have to. If they decide to, then there are conditions that kind of come with that. The RRT approval, and it's just an approval offered in advance, says, okay, FOSC discretion, but don't apply within 1,000 feet of rafting birds, don't spray directly over marine mammals. But if you have to, we understand that the impacts to those animals would be less than if you left them all at the surface. We think it's better for you to disperse in those areas if you meet the right conditions. So that's what the pre-approval is about. It's not unconditional. It's not unilateral. It goes to one person. It provides the FOSC an option. It allows them to access that tool in the toolbox, but they may decide that that's not the right tool. So for a spill in in any other area, within a sanctuary, within 3 miles of shore, within 3 miles of the California-Mexico border, within 1 mile of creeks, and then post-deepwater horizon, we had a couple different uses that we realized we didn't analyze when we were doing the work before. We didn't analyze for subsea use, the kind of use that was used during deepwater horizon. And we didn't figure that there would be any use of dispersants at the surface for more than 5 days, because the potential for continuous releases in California or vessel releases, and it's not, there just aren't opportunities for long-running spills, continuous releases as we had in deepwater horizon. So we didn't analyze for that. And because we didn't analyze for it when we were doing this, we're saying if you're going to consider subsea use or using dispersants at the surface for more than 5 days, you got to go to the RRT. That use is not part of the pre-approval. So the dispersant plan, it's a kind of a big honky thing, probably a little smaller than your training guide. The checklists and stuff take up about 30 pages, and like the fishery closure protocols, most of the meat of it is actually in the appendices. You know, a bunch of different sub-plans. You know, how do we monitor for dispersant effectiveness, or how do we monitor for wildlife impacts, or how do we do public communications, or how do we do seafood safety testing, and blah, 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 blah. There are a lot of sort of sub-plans within the California Dispersant Plan, and those in addition to, so where are the dispersants, and which ones do you use? What type of oil do we have here, and how effectively can they be treated by dispersants? All that information is within the dispersant plan. The dispersant plan, even though our original charge was to just look at zones in federal waters, we did consider all the waters. So this includes the checklist for the pre-approval zone, and the checklist, which is just a little bit different if you're in an RRT approval required zone. So a fairly comprehensive plan. We do have all these embedded ones, and they're all pretty much out of date, especially post-deepwater horizon, and they're being updated to reflect what we learned during that event. We do have a number of different delivery platforms available, whether plane, sometimes a large plane like a C-130 is used, and sometimes smaller turboprop type planes are used. Helicopters that have a bucket suspended, kind of similar to what you'd see in some fire operations, or vessel mounted. These two have a fairly limited operational time. These guys, because they don't carry much, and they have to gas up every now and then, these guys, because they're kind of limited by the swath length of the arms that they've got extended. So the planes can carry more payload and can treat a larger area. So it may be more appropriate for a large offshore response. So the plan will talk, covers what we have available in California or available to California, by cascading stuff in, and that's in the dispersant plan. And last time I gave this presentation, it was a little fresher after Deepwater Horizon, but I wanted to leave these slides in here, even though it's kind of fading into our memories a little bit. And Deepwater Horizon was the largest oil spill and the largest use of dispersants we've ever seen, and hopefully never again, but we learned a lot. So there was aerial spraying that amounted to close to 1 million gallons, and then subsea use of dispersants that was, closer to 1 3/4 million gallons. So that's a lot. In terms of where the oil went, see here, a lot of it, about 40% of it disappeared, I guess, was handled through natural causes, either evaporation or dissolution, or just naturally dispersed. There was, a goodly amount of it that was recovered directly from the wellhead, a small amount of it that was mechanically skimmed, and these were good conditions for skimming, and a lot of assets were put at it, but it's a large spill and a large area to cover, and they just can't get to a lot of it. In-Situ Burning got 5% of it, and that is equivalent to the amount spilled during Exxon Valdez. So people say, they got 5%. Why'd you muck up the air for that long? But 11 million gallons gone is a lot of oil gone. Chemically dispersed, they're saying the same thing. You insulted the ocean for 8%, effectiveness, and 8% of that volume is significant. This slide is a lot of my. A lot of it's me. This is a lot of what I got out of the Deepwater Horizon dispersant use, and a little bit knee-jerk, but I felt like I had to say it anyway. There's a lot of concern about whether dispersants are applied consistent with the policies in the area, offshore Louisiana, and they were. They did have a pre-approval zone. The FOSC applied the dispersants within that pre-approval zone. There are some downsides. They haven't done the Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations, so they got hung up on that, but they applied them properly within the approved zones. The FOSC did direct the response, not BP, which was the responsible party. There was extensive monitoring for dispersant effectiveness. If Jordan hasn't talked to you about that already with the smart stuff, have you?
No.
Okay, will you? Okay. There is a program, acronym is SMART, Special Monitoring for Applied Response Technologies, and it's currently a three-tiered system for determining whether or not a dispersant application has been effective. And that's a lot of it's qualitative. You get into the second and third tiers, and it's a little more quantitative, but not really. And it mostly just tells you whether or not it seems as though oil went into the water. It doesn't get at toxicity, it doesn't really get at oil concentrations. It gives you a sense of whether or not it's worth continuing with your dispersant application. So there was a lot of that went on. There was a lot of monitoring for impacts on human health, including seafood safety, and then a lot of studies on the impacts of water and wildlife. There were additional studies the EPA asked for on the two core exit products, 9527 and 9500, and then 6 other products. So they did kind of an analysis of that. And the Food and Drug Administration came out with their analysis of the components. And again, they are commonly used in foods, cosmetics, over-the-counter medications, and many are, this stands for generally recognized as safe. But again, it's not what they are, it's what they do. So the dispersant use surface and subsea did, in my mind, greatly reduce the shoreline and wildlife impacts. I think the subsea use was genius. I would have never thought of that. The few days when they suspended dispersant operations, it seemed like it was soon after that we saw the shoreline impacts. And I don't think it was coincidental. The seafood safety, there was a lot of seafood safety testing that went on, and it indicated the uptake of oil bioorganisms didn't reach levels of concern for human consumption. And even with the extensive amount of dispersants used in the response, they pretty much behaved the way we thought they would, which was gratifying for me in terms of the planning we'd done in California. It didn't feel like we were way off base in terms of what we used to come up with the pre-approval zones and what we think we need to do in terms of any monitoring related to use. So these are some of the things we used. I mean, we didn't include subsea use or that surface use for more than about 5 days. Hadn't been previously evaluated, so we're saying, okay, we didn't think of that before, so let's not pretend we did. Let's not say that that's a pre-approved use. You'll need to go to the regional response team and let them puzzle it out at the time of the incident. All the rest of those net environmental benefit analysis assumptions still seem to apply. We were engaged before, we re-engaged in the Section 7 consultations under the Endangered Species Act. And then once those are complete, we'll update the California Dispersant Plan. We're currently using the 2008 Dispersant Plan, which seems way out of date. I've been updating some of the appendices, like where are our resources, how much corrects at 9500 we have versus 9527, and what different vessels did the different OSROs get. Updated the contacts and updated some other bits and pieces of it, and I'm kind of reordering it so that Hopefully it'll be a little easier to use. And Jordan and I are kind of working with the RRT on developing a job aid. It's one thing to have a flow chart or several flow charts, but one of the things that we found, at least in drills, is that we don't have enough hints to ourselves about how to get from one box to the other box. So we're working on a job aid to go with the dispersant plan. Okay, in-situ burning, how am I doing on time?
15 minutes plus a little left.
Okay. I think actually we're through the bulk of it. Can we talk a little bit about in-situ burning? Like mechanical, it does get oil gone. It doesn't disappear it somewhere or make you feel like you disappeared it out of the public site. It actually gets it gone. And it can remove large quantities of oil. I mean, even Deepwater Horizon, you look at 3% oil removal by in-situ burn. It doesn't seem like much. When you translate that into 11 million gallons, and the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez oil spill, that seems like a lot. You do have to, well, it's one of these things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to clean up all the sooty, ashy, sticky mess that's left behind, and some of it you can, if it's still on the water surface, and some of it will probably sink, and you're not going to get the residue back out of everywhere, but you should only have small amounts of residue to worry about. All the volatile organic components are destroyed, which is good. And this is similar to dispersants in a way. A dispersed oil plume will spread over a three-dimensional area and fairly quickly and drop the dispersed oil toxic concentrations down to pretty low levels pretty quickly. But you can't see that. It's a lot easier for people, I think, to understand in-situ burn, and they can see it go up in the air and they're like, that's a nasty black cloud. But they're used to seeing forest fires, and they know that the air, especially after you get about 1,000 feet up, will tend to move it around, and pretty soon it's kind of gone. So there's an advantage there. It looks nasty for a while, but the air takes a lot of it. We can do in-situ burns on water or on land. The big concern with in-situ burn is that you do get that black soot. And if it's of a small enough diameter, all those little particles are a small enough diameter, like less than 10 microns, you can take it into your lungs and have problems. You will have some problems in some ways, even if you don't burn the oil. You still have the volatile light and parts of the products available to take into your lungs or contact otherwise. And lots of times those are the BTECs. It's an abbreviation for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. So those components will still be there. They are known carcinogens and can create birth defects. So you still have nasties around, and it's like, there's no good answer. That's what it kind of comes down to. You're coming up with the best answer, but there will be a consequence of everything you do, and you're trying to minimize the most harmful consequences. In-situ burning can't be used everywhere. Oil has to be thick enough to burn. Typically, oil slicks are about, a thick oil slick is 1 millimeter. And typically, it needs to be a little thicker than that to sustain a burn, and so it has to be kind of gathered up. If oil weathers, it can limit the effectiveness of burn. If it forms an oil and water emulsion, that makes it harder to burn. Oceanographic conditions, because you need to, generally speaking, corral this with boom. You have the same limitations with an at-sea response as you would using conventional boom. Above a certain sea state, it's going to be hard to maintain the boom and not just have oil go into the boom, and then you don't have oil to burn anymore. We don't have any fire boom stockpiled in California. I think some of the common wisdom before was, well, just use conventional boom and burn it up. And then you talk to Al Allen, who was doing all the in-situ burning, most of the in-situ burning in Deepwater Horizon, and he says, well, poof, it's gone. I mean, the fire boom, some of it's water cooled, some of it's just got a lot of fire retardant material on it, but it's good for they said about 12 to 14 burns. And so you get longer use out of it. The limitations are that we don't have any in California. The closest is in Washington, so it's about 24 hours away. But it is pretty good at what it does. It does have some of the limitations of a conventional boom. You know, you get into advanced sea states, which is what we typically have offshore California. You can't contain the oil well enough to burn it. So first you need to corral it to get your minimum oil thickness. You need to generally be able to ignite it. I think they've used a helitorch in some in-situ burn situations, and that's what's shown here. I think during Deepwater Horizon they just ended up using something like, what's the gel gasoline, the napalm kind of stuff he was talking about. And then they went to a gel diesel, and I think sometimes they were just using road flares. And it's like the in-situ burn teams are kind of like vying for who got to go south the fire. My turn. So, I mean, they thought it was pretty fun. One of the things in California and throughout the country is that once you start a burn, you need to be able to stop it. You need to have the capability to stop it, because a lot of our permissions and approvals, if you're not far enough offshore, if the smoke starts to go toward population centers or workers or something like that, you need to be able to control the burn and put it out. And you can do it pretty easily, apparently, by just pulling the boom faster, and it basically draws water over the oil and drowns it.
How do they do that with girders?
I don't know. They'll have to come up with something else, huh?
I guess.
Or maybe you can only use herders. For Ben's talking about this talk that we had during the technology workshop last week, where they were talking about using chemical herders to corral the oil, and in that case they're not using in-situ burn. I'm just guessing that even though the one example they showed it was close to a shore, if they don't have a way to effectively, easily, quickly drown an in-situ burn, they maybe are just relegated to doing it pretty far offshore, away from population centers. I don't know.
Ellen?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that allows in-situ burning to happen is you have to have a minimum thickness of oil. So it may be that they've never used herders for this purpose operation, but I would think that if you were able to disturb the herding agent from around the edge of the oil, so that the oil spreads out more thinner, then it's going to go out. So maybe if you had a fire monitor there that could break up the edges of it, then it would spread out. It would make them as well.
They also make oil
One of the
splitters.
ways to douse the in-situ burn using boom is just to pull the boom away from it, and then the oil will spread out, and then it would get too thin and it would go out. So maybe the same solution.
Yeah. It may depend on how much reaction time you're allowed. Mentioned before, but according to our plan, after the burn is done, you're supposed to try and clean up all the oil residue, and it can be, a mess that you can. Here it's kind of piled up within a boom next to the vessel. Okay, we do have, like a dispersant plan, we have a California in-situ burn plan, and it is also kind of broken up into zones and permissions based on where you are. So there's a pre-approval. Again, it's all, because the regional response team has to approve all uses of applied response technologies. This is their pre-approval to the federal on-scene coordinator. As with dispersants, it doesn't demand that the FOSC use an in-situ burn in all situations for spills 35 miles or more offshore, but it gives that FOSC the option. So totally at their discretion. They can make their decision and then inform the RRT of what the decision was. If we're offshore waters 0 to 35 miles from shore, we have like two little processes. One is a quick approval that was worked out with the various air boards and air districts going along the California coastline, and each of them offered a specific distance from shore, where if the wind was blowing offshore or parallel to shore, they gave a quick approval for in-situ burn, basically a pre-approval. Anything else is case by case. All other areas, all other wind conditions. And this is just a quick list, not on your test, but just kind of the difference in how the various air districts have managed this. Some are, less than half a mile from shore, as long as the wind is offshore, parallel to shore. They've said, okay, this can be a quick approval zone. Other areas are a little further, 3 or 5 miles from shore. Monterey Bay, because the winds are just so squirrely in there, very unpredictable, such a large, deep bay, that they couldn't come up with, the air district there couldn't come up with a quick approval zone that they were comfortable with. But I'm surprised by how, can you imagine, talk about needing to do some public communication, an in-situ burn less than half a mile from shore off San Diego, even if the wind's blowing offshore.
That'd be typo. That'd be typo, right? Period. Point.
0.5.
That'd be fine.
No, half a mile. A lot of these are half a mile. I did not misplace that decimal point. Okay, so I think I'm kind of coasting to the finish here. We keep saying it's hard for people to accept. I mean, it's hard to accept it. Okay in concept, but people have a hard time making this happen. We keep saying, I'm getting tired of this phrase, but we say we want to have all the tools in the toolbox. So we put some things in the toolbox. We put a lot of work into dispersant net environmental benefit analyses to see if it could come up with pre-approval zones that would encourage the Westfield response organizations to go ahead and get some dispersant and dispersant application platforms in place, even though we may never use them. We've done a lot of work with In-Situ Burning and coming up with policies and monitoring and quick approvals and all that kind of stuff for that. The likelihood of using In-Situ Burn in conditions we typically have in California, I don't know, slim, none. We do get some control a little bit over what type of stuff we pour into the water. It doesn't mean that we know everything we need to know about it. More research is definitely needed. But we're better off than other states that don't have a licensing program, and so they don't know as much about some of their products as we do. And it's just kind of a refresher of the kind of different approval tiers that we need to go through, some of the checks and balances. We can have, some of the dispersant use, some of the other ART uses like solidifiers, they can be pre-approved. That doesn't mean that there's unilateral carte blanche or a requirement to use those oil spill cleanup agents in every situation. Everything else pretty much is incident-specific RRT approval is required. And that's something that during a spill or a drill, Jordan and I kind of broker. And we do it within the environmental unit. And we look at the incident, we determine what type of oil was spilled. I'm thinking of dispersants now, but what type of oil was spilled? Is it a dispersible oil? Do we have what we need to disperse it? Would there be a net environmental benefit to a dispersant use? And we can kind of condition it. We can say, okay, our trustee agency said, no, they're kind of okay with it, but they want to stay 2,000 feet away from rafting birds or something. We take that to the federal on-scene coordinator. If we're in a FOSC pre-approval zone, well, here's politics. Even with our pre-approval zone right now, because of some of the concerns and lawsuits that came out of Deepwater Horizon, we're even treating our pre-approval zones as it's best to go to the RRT and get their way in on it. So during drills, we're treating all California waters. When we're looking at a dispersant use, we're taking it to the RRT. But for a pre-approval zone, we have the benefit of having already done that net environmental benefit analysis. That's still there. We've looked at all the species that are typically there, what the effects on them would typically be. And then lots of times we have our trustee agencies in the command post with us, and so we could say, is this still true? I mean, is there something different that's going on right now that we didn't know about then? Or something else that would just make you more comfortable with the implementation of the dispersant use and the monitoring that follows up from that. And so we take that to the federal on-scene coordinator, and the federal on-scene coordinator, basically what we're trying to determine, is there a net environmental benefit? And is it operationally feasible? And then the FOSC decides, I'm kind of interested in doing this. Let's go to the RRT and see if we can get their approval. And then we have a conference call with the RRT, and they kind of weigh in. They say yay or nay, because they can. Or they may apply some other conditions or ask us to modify the plan or just give kind of a conditional approval, initial approval, and say to do a test, something like that. But it's kind of a stepped process, no matter whether you're in a pre-approval or an incident-specific approval. It doesn't happen easily, but it can happen fairly quickly because we're trying to get people pretty conversant with the topic, and so they understand the sort of trade-offs we're making, and they understand we're not trying to hide anything, that we're really trying to make some strategic decisions, difficult decisions. And the federal on-scene coordinator and the RRT still have the discretion to say, I don't care if there's an environmental benefit, it's going to screw my career, I don't want to do it. And so they can pull the plug on it. And then, what we're just going to have to say is, well then, we'll have to go at it with other response tools and hope for the best. It wouldn't be an effective response probably if we couldn't use some of these ARTs in some situations. So In-Situ Burning, it also has its approval processes, just kind of reviewed for you there. That's it. The